All right, so in this video, we're going to look at how to work with date objects in a Polars data frame. All right, so again, using this kind of starter code that I've used in a lot of videos in this playlist. So importing pandas, importing polars, creating a sales data PD object, so a data frame using pandas, and then a polars data frame. All right, so let's first look at this in pandas, right? So in particular, in this data, we have an order date and a ship date. Those are the two columns that we have that are corresponding to days. So let's think of a simple task that we want to kind of look at, and then we'll see how to do this with both pandas and polars. So let's compute. Ultimately, what we want to do is compute the difference between the ship date or the order date and ship date, and we'll say in days. All right, so right now in pandas, if I were to look at the D types, the order date and the ship date, those are both objects, so they are not recognized as being a date time. So if we're trying to work with date columns in Python, we typically want those to be date time objects. Those are a proper type in the Python language. So to do that, when we were doing our pandas basics, we saw we could do something like this. Well, give me that order date column. All right, and pandas has a PD to date time method. All right, and notice that when I run that, it's like magic, right? So here's my original series of type object, and then when I wrap that in PD to datetime, we get back a datetime object. So we can overwrite that column. And then we can do the same thing with, what was it, our ship date. All right. All right, so now if I were to look at my data, let's do .head. All right, so it doesn't really look like a whole lot has changed, right, in the way that they're depicted visually. But if we do our D types, we can see that they are now datetime objects. All right. And what I'm going to do at this point, right, is, so we saw that those are both datetime objects, right? So if I were to take ship date as a column, get that back, that's going to return a panda series. That's a datetime, and I can subtract the order date, which is also going to be a series. It should be a datetime, but when you subtract two datetimes, you actually get a different type of object. This is a time delta, okay? So a time delta object is a little bit different from a datetime because it's a difference of two times. All right, so just so we can kind of see how to work with this, I'm just going to say difference is equal to that. All right, so these values are time delta values, and I should be able to use that DT. Let's just see, my tab completion wasn't working very well. All right, so I've wrapped that in a dir. All right, so we could get things like in this case, it does have days. Here's some of the methods we can get, we can get the total number of seconds and things like that. Or you can actually divide it by a time delta and convert it back to, a date-like object. Or in this case, we want to get the difference between this and day, so we would maybe want an integer or even a floating point object. All right, let's just see. Right now we've got this difference, and we've got this, we're using the DT accessor because we're working with times. Let's see what this days will return. So if I do dt.days, let's take that dir off. All right, so now we get the difference in days. So if I were to look at my sales data pd.head, there we go. So in that first one, so it was ordered on the 8th, shipped on the 11th. So that's 3 days in between. If I go down to index position 2, ordered on the 11th, shipped on the 18th. So that's 7 days between. All right. So what I can do, since I'm all I'm doing is taking that difference and then, calling .dt.days on what it returns. I can do that all in one line. All right, so we'll do that computation first. That returns that time delta, and then I can do a dt.days, and then this is going to be the code to do that in Pandas. All right, so now if I do my sales data PD, not head, let's just do 3. There we go. So the only thing, we're not actually saving that as a column. So let's say sales data PD. Let's say time before ship is equal to that difference. All right, so now we should have a new column, time before ship, and this is equal to that. All right, let's just do a little bit of timing check, and then we'll see how to do that same task in Polars. All right, so it takes about 1.7 milliseconds. In this case, we've got to do these 2 conversions to date time, one for order date and ship date, and then I've got this additional object right here that's creating that difference. We're calculating that difference, and then I'm saving that here. I could make this a little bit fewer lines of code because all I'm doing is taking the whatever this statement evaluates to and assigning it to that column. So I could technically just replace difference. We don't technically need to define that variable. So we could put that all together and it would result in something like this. So 3 lines of code, not too bad. In this case, the dates are formatted in kind of a nice format. So Pandas was able to pick up and say, I understand what that format is. Of course, if you ever run into cases where Pandas says, I can't figure that out, right, you can go into the toDatetime method and you can explicitly set a format, right? So if I were to see if I can find, so the format, right, so you can give it some type of a representation of what format to expect, and they do have documents that you can look at to get an idea of what those formatting rules are. All right, so let's see what we can do with Polars. All right, so here's our Polars DataFrame. We are going to be, first we need to do this conversions on these columns. So to do changes on a column, we want to use that with columns, and we'll use that expression syntax. So first we'll do a PL call, and then let's do order date. All right. And let's do them individually first, and then we're going to try something. So right now, order date is a string. So if I were to look at Polars documentation, let's pull that up. So Polars, I'm going to go to their user guide. Let's see, I think I actually need to go to the API reference, Python, get the Python docs. Now if in that expressions area, this would fall under your temporal. Or no, we're actually working with strings here, sorry. So I'm going to go to their strings. So I've got a polar expression. I need to use a string mode because it's currently a string. And it has a toDatetime method. So you can call it toDatetime. Again, you can specify a format if Polars is not able to figure that out automatically. So let's see what happens. So I can say .str.toDatetime. All right. And then within that same block, I can say, do that with ship date. All right. In this case, let's see what it's so it's giving me an error. All right. It's saying, hey, something failed, right? So the column order date conversion from string to a date time failed for 90 out of 132 values. All right, so apparently Polars is not able to figure out what that format is, right? So this will be a great example for us to kind of look through and see how we specify those formats. All right, so let's look at this real quick. So let's look at salesdata.pl. Let's look at the head 3. All right, so let's actually get a few more in there. Let's get 5. Yeah, here's what I wanted to see. If you notice, it looks like we've got a month, day, year, but notice that the month, right? So it's not 0 padded, right? It's just 6 for June instead of 0, 6. Let's look at a few more. Let's look at the tail as well. Yeah, so the same thing for the day, like in this entry right here, right? The month is not 0 padded, the day is not 0 padded, and maybe that matters. All right, so let's go back to our pandas or Polars documentation. All right, so it says, okay, with toDatetime, if we want to try to set a format, it says, hey, refer to this chrono crate documentation. So it uses a particular crate because Polars uses Rust underneath the hood. So we have to come up with a string that can kind of represent our data. And if we look at it again, it's going to be month, day, year. And that month is and day is not 0 padded. All right, so I'm going to pull that documentation back up. All right, and what we've got to do is we got to go through and figure out these little string representations right here and figure out a way to express that format using that. Okay, so let's go through here. So this is going to be our year. That's fine. So we need a %y. All right, let's look for things. So the day number is going to, so this is a day number, 0 padded right here. I don't know if that's going to be an issue. So we got the day number. This one is space padded. All right. And let's see what we have for months, right? So we have the month right here. It says it's 0 padded to 2 digits. Do we have anything while I'm looking here? So those are going to be for time. And then it's also possible to override the default padding. So suppresses any padding. So if, that is equal to that, we can suppress that padding, putting that negative sign. So let's give this a shot. So it looks like what we've got is we've got a month, even though ours isn't 0 padded, I'm wondering if it will figure that out. So it looks like to get the months, we need to do this M, %M to do the day. Maybe let's try this D, and then a capital Y. So M, lowercase m, D, and Y. And it's separated with backslashes. All right, so let's give this a shot. All right, so I'm going to say format equals M/D capital Y. All right. Month, day, year, month, day, year. Perfect. So even though it was looking for the padding, it apparently didn't prevent it because that is correct right there. All right, so that converts that to a datetime. In this case, Polars did not pick it up automatically. So we had to specify format. And again, if pandas were to fail, right, it's the same thing. You can use pandas documentation to go through and see its particular keywords. But basically what you're trying to do is figure out, using those descriptions that it gives you back, can I come up with a pattern that matches what we're seeing? And again, if it's separated with hyphens versus this, in this case, this /, you've got to make sure that that matches up. All right. Now, in this case, we've got 2 separate lines doing this conversion. I do believe that instead of doing that twice, you can just provide PL call that expression with a list and say, hey, take both of these columns and do that all in one go. All right. All right, now, so this with column statement goes through and it does those conversions from strings to datetime objects. All right, so now we're going to do another with column statement. It's actually important that these two be following one another, right? So I'm going to do that conversion here to do that difference and then hopefully convert that to days. But I can't do it in the same with column statement that I had previously. Why? Because at the time of execution of this with column statement that's highlighted, order date and ship date, they're not yet date times, right? We're doing that conversion in there. So by putting this statement following it in a separate with columns, I'm basically saying, okay, well, wait till that is done and then do the expressions or the computations that I defined here. So when we get to this with column block, order date and ship date should be date times. So now I'll do a PL call. Here's my expression. I want to do ship date minus order date. Okay. And then I'm going to, let's just run this real quick. Let me actually go to the other side here. And then I'm going to say this is going to be my, what do we call this, time before ship. All right, let me keep this going with head 3. All right, so now if I go far to the right, well, notice we got those date times right there. And if I go far to the right, we have what's called a duration column. All right, it says 3 days. All right, so now we've got this time before ship. So apparently this expression is computing a duration, right? So instead of a time delta, Polars is calling it a duration. All right, so now I'm going to go back to the documentation. So we were looking at this string to date time, so that we converted that string to a date time. But now that we actually have an object that is related to dates, in this case it's a duration, could have been a date time or a duration, I can go to this temporal area, right? And now we can look and we can see what methods are available to us, right? So if we do a DT and then there's a total days, right? So it says extract the total days from a duration type. Perfect. We saw that we in fact do have a duration type. So then I can do a .dt .days total days, right? And there we go. So there's our 3, 3, and 7, which was equivalent to what we had. Now in this case, Polars versus pandas as far as which one is more readable. I think they're both actually kind of readable here. With pandas, we did these 3 separate statements. That with Polars, we always want to be thinking about, can I build this thing in kind of a sequence of calls on objects? So I want to be able to chain these things together. And there's some very real benefits we'll talk about towards the end of this playlist for doing so. But we want to kind of get away from this, okay, we're creating these single statements that aren't connected with one another, and see if we can kind of chain together an analytical pipeline. All right, let's do the timing real quick. Time it. All right, so 590 microseconds. So, about probably less than around 33-ish%. So let's just go ahead and do that. 590 divided by 1710, 34%. All right, so that was working with date times in Polars, and in this case, or working with data. And in this case, it was encoded as a string, or originally encoded as a string. So we had to use the string methods, the string accessor to get that to datetime function. And then once we got it to a datetime, we created this duration, and then we could use that temporal accessor, which is DT. And again, the accessors are very similar in pandas and Polars. So we have a DT accessor in pandas, and we have a DT for the temporal accessor in Polars. All right, so that is the end of this video.